Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm sure we can all agree, Madam Speaker, that one of the most significant values, if you like, that we have in the fabric of our society is our built heritage, our Aboriginal heritage, our wilderness heritage, Madam Speaker, and a remarkable island community character that is in significant part comes out of those attributes that make this place quite unique in the world. And Madam Speaker, for members of this place who have travelled to other parts of Australia particularly, you'll recognise that there is nowhere in this country that has such a wealth of built European heritage as Tasmania. And in fact, I would argue, Madam Speaker, that Launceston particularly is one of the most remarkable heritage-rich places in the entire country, and it's certainly something of which we should be very proud and collectively be committed to protecting, conserving, for current and future generations, Madam Speaker, as well as for its own intrinsic value as part of that cultural identity fabric of who we are as Tasmanians. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been a patchy and variable record of this government's on the protection of European cultural heritage or historic cultural heritage. There was the previous Minister for Heritage and State Growth, Mr Groom, who very shortly after coming into office, like a wrecking ball, first of all took apart the Tasmanian Climate Action Council, first piece of legislative perfidy that he inflicted on the people of Tasmania, and then set about a process of gutting the Tasmanian Heritage Register. And it was a process that hadn't been taken to the people at an election. Heritage wasn't mentioned by the Liberals in the lead up to the 2014 state election, Madam Speaker. Sorry, the 2014 state election. Just as at the 2018 state election, there was no mention of this government's decision to privatise the Treasury building, which is one of our absolute heritage icons. And there's a process here of I think, eroding the heritage fabric of Tasmania by stealth. You had a process that was a ham-fisted removal of places of significance from the Tasmanian Heritage Register that was not consulted. And we lost places from the register, for example, Madam Speaker, if you go back and you have a look at what was taken off the register, whole streetscapes. And that's one of the problems with the Historic Cultural Heritage Act that these amendments do not address. There is no protection in the Act for significant streetscapes. So while one house, for example, in Balaclava Street, Invermay, may not have those attributes that make it a place of state significance for registration on the Heritage Register, as part of a streetscape that points to a time in our history, that house in Balaclava Street does have significant value. And the removals that took, I think, in total, although the initial target set by the Minister in Heritage Tasmania was for there to be 1,683 properties removed from a heritage register that has around 5,500 or had around 5,500 properties on it. In the end, I think the number was closer to 500, Madam Speaker, and I like to think that community opposition to the gutting of the heritage register had something to do with that. But, for example, in Launceston, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 houses in Balaclava Street, Invermay, in one fell swoop, were removed from the heritage register. A dozen houses in Bedford Street in Invermay removed from the heritage register. 8 houses in Goodwin Street, Invermay, off the register, and on it goes. And one of the saddest examples of this incapacity under the current legislative framework to protect streetscapes was what happened to Balfour Street in Launceston. Madam Speaker, there were about close to 40 properties removed from the Heritage Register in Balfour Street, Launceston. Now, obviously, that street, as a streetscape, and a place that had an important story to tell about our European history has value, Madam Speaker. If there are 40 houses on Balfour Street that make up a picture of a time in our history, they have a heritage value. And we would argue that is value of state significance, Madam Speaker. In Hobart, of course, the gutting continued. We had houses in Battery Point removed from the register, in Bath Street, Colville Street, in Hampden Road, Denern, in Newtown Road, again, 10 houses removed from the register, Argyle Street, Stokes Street, Commercial Road, and beautiful little George Street in North Hobart, again, Madam Speaker, not unlike Balfour Street in Launceston, where dozens of houses were taken off the Tasmanian Heritage Register in a process which was political and ham-fisted and hamstrung by the fact that the Historic Cultural Heritage Act does not protect streetscapes, Madam Speaker. So we have a diminished register after 5 years of the Liberals in government, and we have arguably one of our handful of most significant heritage icons now being hawked through the government's expressions of interest process for developing the Treasury building. And I have here the Treasurer's media release, which I might remind the House, I know this is a slightly inside Beltway comment, but this statement announcing that registrations of interest would be open for the publicly owned iconic heritage building came out at about 2 o'clock, 2:30 on a Friday afternoon by way of media release. Now, this is a Treasurer who's part of a government that will literally turn up to the opening of an envelope, yet didn't have the courage, Madam Speaker, to front the people, front the media and answer questions about a process for flogging the Treasury building, which belongs to the people of Tasmania. Now, we might have the Treasurer, who is the chief architect of this perfidy, get up shortly and say, no, we're not selling it. Divestment takes many forms. What we're talking about here is up to a 99-year lease. Well, Madam Speaker, that's as good as a sale. That is privatisation of a public asset without reference to the people of Tasmania. So we went to the March state election, Madam Speaker, not a word about this government's plans for the Treasury building, and we come back and shortly thereafter, in May of 2018, the Treasurer announces that they are in fact going to flog off the Treasury building. Now, the language has changed a little bit, Madam Speaker, and I like to think that's because the Liberal establishment has been beating a path to the Treasurer's and the Premier's door about the plans for the Treasury building, but it has not bought this process or the plan anything like a social licence, Madam Speaker. And what we've got here is this kind of Orwellian language. Get this. The Hodgman majority Liberal government has taken the view that there is an opportunity to reimagine the purpose of the Treasury Buildings complex for the benefit of all Tasmanians. Bollocks. Whilst enabling improved public access and enhancing the heritage aspects of these magnificent buildings. And the Treasurer goes on to say, mind you, not in front of the cameras or the people of Tasmania, as I've said, divestment takes many forms and the government will consider proposals including freehold interest with covenants to protect and conserve the buildings for future generations, as well as long-term leasehold of up to 99 years. So, Madam Speaker, we've got here, there's another striking sentence. Proposals must demonstrate tangible benefits to the community and maintain and conserve the site's rich heritage. How do you define tangible benefits to the community when a heritage asset is being taken away from the community, taken out of public hands? It is likely to go to a multinational corporation or to a company wholly owned by a foreign government, and Mr Gutwin knows exactly what I'm talking about there. So where is there a tangible benefit to the community if profits are going overseas and if public access is not part of the registration of interest? Madam Speaker, we would argue, the Greens would argue, that there is absolutely no mandate for disposing of the heritage buildings that are the Treasury building complex, that the Treasurer and the Liberals should have had the courage to flag this to the Tasmanian people before the March 2018 state election. Instead, they were too busy raking in the dark money from the gambling industry to illegitimately get them back into government, Madam Speaker. So we have, according to the Treasurer, proponents have until the 2nd of October 2019 to respond and register their interest. So my question to the Treasurer, as the alleged Minister responsible for heritage, is what level of public scrutiny or transparency will there be about those registrations of interest? Will it be the same offensive dismissal that we get when we seek information on the privatisation of protected areas, for example, through the Office of the Coordinator-General, and we're told it's all commercial in confidence? I'll bet you London to a brick, Madam Speaker, that's exactly what happens this time, that preferred developers will be red carpeted into the Office of the Coordinator-General. They will be massaged and poured cups of tea, Madam Speaker, and be helped to guide. They will be guided through the process of a registration of interest, Madam Speaker. That's what the Office of the Coordinator-General does, Madam Speaker. It is a behind closed doors, exclusive space for moneyed interests, corporate interests, who are invariably not interested in the public interest, Madam Speaker. And the notion that a government would not be transparent, first of all, about its plans for a building that is at the heart of democracy and governance in Tasmania. That notion is highly offensive, but then on this government's track record, we are likely to see the secrecy and lack of transparency about the privatisation of a public asset continue and be embedded into the process, Madam Speaker. That is what happens all the time in the past 5 years under the Liberal government. And not consulted, no mandate, lack of transparency, and, you know, to be honest, Madam Speaker, it's quite alarming that you could just have a government swan in and say, well, see that public asset, which is a heritage treasure, which is at the heart of our democracy, we, the Liberals, have decided to divest it. But don't worry, divestment takes many forms, and we think it's really important that the owners of that building are given an opportunity to reimagine its future. They weren't given an opportunity to have any say in the future public ownership and public use of the Treasury building. And I'm absolutely certain, Madam Speaker, given the correspondence that we get, that this decision to flog the public Treasury building will come back to bite the Treasurer on the backside, and maybe he doesn't care so much because he's in the north of the state, but certainly for southern members, this decision, as it gets closer to conclusion, will hurt Liberal members in the south of Tasmania, because there's a couple of truths in politics, and one of them is mostly voters hate privatisation, and they hate it because they know that they're having something that has been vested in them, that belongs to them, taken away. And that's what's happening here, Madam Speaker. A long-term lease for 99 years is privatisation of a public heritage treasure. People hate privatisation, and that's what this is. And we will keep explaining to the government and to anyone else who will listen that this is privatisation. That's what we're dealing with here, the privatisation of the Treasury building. It goes to the core of the fact that this Treasurer particularly knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And the purpose here is clearly to fatten up the coffers before the next state election off the back of a public asset. And this from a government who, when it came into office, the Premier said, "My government will not be a privatising government." And that was a lie, Madam Speaker. That was a lie that he told to the people of Tasmania. Now, as for the Historic Cultural Heritage Amendment Bill 2019, my first question to the Minister is, why was there no consultation whatsoever with heritage groups, with individuals, for example, who are ICOMOS representatives in Tasmania and other interested parties who have dedicated themselves to protecting and speaking for Tasmania's remarkable historic cultural heritage? We've asked around, Madam Speaker, and key players, key stakeholders in the heritage space did not know about this bill until it landed in the Parliament. Now, that is contemptuous of those people who have dedicated so much of their volunteer time to protecting and advocating for Tasmania's remarkable European cultural heritage. It's contemptuous, Madam Speaker, utterly contemptuous. There was no harm at all in consulting with heritage stakeholders, but clearly a decision has been made not to ask them what they thought. And perhaps, Madam Speaker, that's because there are other significant improvements to the Historic Cultural Heritage Act that need to be made off the back of reports that have recommended significant changes. There's some 27 recommendations made in a report that came out, I think, in 2005, but maybe when we go into committee. That's right, the 2005 Mackay-Hacker Review, a series of important amendments. And the concern is that the failure to appropriately amend the legislation to implement some of these recommendations continues to see really significant heritage being destroyed or irreparably damaged, because Heritage Tasmania, or the Tasmanian Heritage Council, argue that it can't prevent this because of the constraints of the Act. So we had an opportunity here, Madam Speaker, to make those sorts of substantial changes to the legislation that are clearly required. So, Madam Speaker, the other matter, of course, is that the National Trust is an organisation that we collectively rely on to look after some of our most significant heritage buildings, and they are starved of funds, Madam Speaker, wholly dependent on volunteers to do the works on those heritage buildings, and struggling for the resources that they desperately need to keep some of our most beautiful buildings in good health. There's been no extension of the funding that the National Trust needs in order to do its work, and I think it's an indictment, Madam Speaker, on this government. Now, in relation to this bill specifically, it makes a number of mechanical changes to the Act, and in the 2014 legislation that my former colleague Mr Whiteman brought through this place, the new legislation brought together the Historic Cultural Heritage Act and the planning system, and obviously since it was enacted there have been a number of bumps within the implementation of the Act that need to be smoothed out, Madam Speaker, and they are: in the event that additional information or revised plans are forwarded to the Heritage Council following its notification of interest or notice of decision, and that information reflects a substantial change in the proposed development, the Heritage Council may revise its notice of interest or notice of decision. And we have asked some of our local government representatives, Madam Speaker, and they are supportive of that change. The amendments also provide that in the event that a planning authority fails to forward a development application to the Heritage Council is provided the opportunity and time to consider, and should it deem necessary, provide comment on the development application prior to a final decision of the planning authority. The amendments also allow the Heritage Council to be party to the assessment of a combined planning and development application under the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act. The amendments introduce and define the role of authorised officers to investigate compliance, and Madam Speaker, this is an area of particular particular concern to stakeholders in the heritage space and to the Greens, where there are situations where developers or property owners basically take the view that they can demolish first and answer questions about that demolition later, and there's an historically significant wall in Launceston that went under the sledgehammer, apparently under just those circumstances, Madam Speaker. So it's all very well to have legislation in place that is designed to some extent, protect heritage, but if you don't have compliance and enforcement capacity, the effectiveness of the legislation is substantially undermined. And of course, it's also, Madam Speaker, it's a cultural issue. If you think that if some developers think it is more cost efficient and time efficient for them to bulldoze first and answer questions later, that is a cultural issue that has been created by inadequate compliance with the Historic Cultural Heritage Act in the past, Madam Speaker. So I do need to, on behalf of stakeholders who've expressed concern to us, ask the Minister why there was no consultation on this legislation. We have an amendment to put forward to the sections in the Act which allow for significant decisions to be made out of session, and remembering that the Tasmanian Heritage Council has 15 members, while the Principal Act sets a quorum at 7, the threshold in this Act under these amendments for an out-of-session significant decision in relation to cultural heritage sits at 7, which is less than half the composition of the Tasmanian Heritage Council. So we'll be moving an amendment that lifts that to 8, so at least you've got more than half the council who are participating in significant decisions. So the two amendments that we have, first of all, being helpful and useful to the government, there is no definition of commission in the legislation. Now, obviously, I believe it's the Tasmanian Planning Commission, but the word commission is used in the legislation without any definition, so we propose a new clause A on page 4 before clause 4, which simply inserts the definition of the Tasmanian Planning Commission. And the second amendment amends clause 16, paragraph A, and proposes a new subclause. Proposes that new subclause 1 is amended by deleting 7 and inserting instead 8. It is not adequate to set up a new process for the Heritage Council to make significant decisions about works on heritage properties or development applications that may impact on heritage properties with less than half of the Heritage Council constituted to make that decision. There's a couple of other issues here that have been raised with us by stakeholders. That was one of them, particularly concerning. And I'll just read out the concern in a complete form from Anne McConnell, who is a heritage expert and also a representative of the United Nations heritage body, ICOMOS. In section 16, schedule 2, section 5A, this is the resolutions outside of meetings, Ms McConnell says this proposed amendment is of concern as it's a significant departure from how the Tasmanian Heritage Council makes decisions as a council. While I'm not opposed to resolutions outside of meetings per se, I am concerned that this amendment does not seem to make any provision for the full Tasmanian Heritage Council to make a full and informed decision and for the full council to vote. And as she reads it, there only seems to require 7 members to sign to say they agree with a particular document. There appears to be 1, no clarity around when an out-of-meeting resolution can be considered. 2, no requirement for the document to be circulated to the full council prior to getting 7 signatures. 3, no requirement for the full Tasmanian Heritage Council to vote and no provision for other views to be recorded. And 4, no requirement for consultation with the chair of the THC. This all seems, Ms McConnell says, very irregular. And there is a risk here, of course, Madam Speaker, that the council, and I'm not talking about the current council as it's made up or any particular individuals on the council, but there is a potential here, given that we're lowering the threshold for decision making, for a group of people on the council to form a block, if you like, and with less than half the members, make some very pro-developer decisions, Madam Speaker. That is of significant concern. That's the major concern. And in relation to the lack of consultation, Ms McConnell says this: it is extremely poor and unacceptable process to not allow public comment and especially heritage profession feedback on matters relating to cultural heritage, as the Act deals with matters of public benefit and in this case, which potentially directly affects the public in relation to proposed Amendment 15. I can see no excuse therefore in relation to this bill for such a lack of openness and transparency about the amendments happening or for denying an opportunity for public review and comment. I believe that the government should be challenged about the lack of transparency that they have used. And the second point she makes is the lack of public openness about the process has meant that yet again, 2 amendments later, Heritage Tasmania or the Heritage Council can fly under the radar and avoid making important amendments to improve the protection of cultural heritage. In particular, a number of amendments recommended by the 2005 Mackay Historic Cultural Heritage Review. The failure to appropriately amend the legislation to implement some of these recommendations continues to see really significant heritage being destroyed or irreparably damaged because the Heritage Tasmania or the Council argues that it can't prevent this because of the constraints of the Act. Madam Speaker, with something as significant as our historic European cultural heritage, there should be the most inclusive and open conversation within the community and with key stakeholders who've dedicated substantial parts of their lives to the protection and promotion of Tasmania's European cultural heritage. The lack of openness in relation to this amendment bill is hard to understand. And of course, when there's a process that's really untransparent, it raises, I think, quite legitimate scepticism about the thinking that went into this amendment bill. Now, Madam Speaker, you know, there's nothing in here that's terribly offensive, and we hope that the Minister will accept our amendments, but there's nothing in here that strengthens heritage protections for Tasmania's historic cultural heritage. Nothing in this amendment bill does that, Madam Speaker. Now, of course, this is consistent with the government's position on European cultural heritage, where they pay lip service to it, but by deed undermine protections for our built heritage, Madam Speaker. I cannot understand why this has been such a secretive process, why the development of this bill was so secretive, why there was no public consultation. Madam Speaker, when you're talking about an asset base, for want of a better term, that is integral to our cultural identity as settlers, if you like, as non-Aboriginal Tasmanians, Madam Speaker. And I just think it's poor form. I look at who the Minister is and I'm a little less surprised, Madam Speaker, because this Minister, well, you think it's funny.
Oh, I do. Look, I think, to be frank, you look for a conspiracy anyway.
Order
This actually strengthens the act.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't strengthen protection for heritage.
Through the
It
chair.
does not.
Absolutely. It ensures that the Heritage Council is informed when before it wouldn't have been in terms of applications passing through the process, and it puts in place authorised officers. It strengthens the Act, and you know that.
Okay, that's enough. Through the chair, please.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'm not going to cop that sort of garbage from that minister, because by deed, Mr Gutwin, you are no friend of Tasmania's built heritage. You are no friend of Tasmania's natural heritage. That's what I see when I look at you, Mr Gutwin. So we will be needing to go into committee, Madam Speaker, in order to put our amendments that will, you know, at the margins, make some improvements to this legislation. We're not going to vote against it, obviously, but we think it is a real missed opportunity to implement some of those recommendations that came through from heritage experts 14 years ago, and to be really transparent about, you know, what your policy is in relation to European cultural heritage. And as far as I can see, Madam Speaker, and I've looked, there is no strategy for Tasmania's European heritage, and we need a plan to make sure that it's not trashed within the term of a government, that we're not losing significant buildings and significant attributes.
Thank you. Thank you.